Shavua Tov, everyone, and welcome back to the second presentation in our series of shiurim and presentations for the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av regarding the Betamigdash. My name is Les Seidel. I'm the director of the Showbread Institute, Machon Lechem HaPanim in Israel. And in our institute, we research the Lechem HaPanim, trying to duplicate the way they baked it 2,000 years ago, what ingredients they used, what kelim, all the different methods of baking. We also do research into the symbolism and the deeper meaning of the Lechem HaPanim. And today we're going to be talking about reflections of the Betamigdash, which are in our own anatomy and physiology. It's one of the groundbreaking discoveries we made while researching the Lechem HaPanim. And we researched this further and we made amazing groundbreaking discoveries as part of today's topic. It's being published for the first time, so you guys are the first to be hearing about it publicly. The whole issue with the parallels between the Betamigdash and the human anatomy and physiology began when we discovered in our research a coin from the time of Beit Sheni, which had a picture of the Lechem HaPanim stacked above the Shulchan. This was from the time of Beit Sheni. And when we spoke about it in last week's presentation, when I saw this picture, it triggered a memory of a picture that I had seen in a physiology and anatomy book. I'm one of those mishagoyim who is mishuga about anatomy and physiology. I read biochemistry books for fun. And when I saw this picture, it triggered a memory of some picture that I had seen in a physiology book. And it got me started researching the topic of the parallels between the Mikdash and are there reflections in our own human anatomy? And there are, and we're going to be seeing that is the topic of today's presentation. Let's begin. In Sefer Bereshit, Parshat Bereshit, when Hashem created man, it says, Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oto, zachar u'nekeva bara otam. Kadosh Baruch Hu created human beings, b'tzelem Elokim. What does it mean, B'Tselem Elokim? What does it, B'Tselem Elokim, actually entail when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created humans? So obviously it means there was some kind of blueprint that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, which reflects something higher up, something more spiritual. B'Tselem Elokim. What exactly B'Tselem Elokim is, we're going to discuss this a little bit later. But in order to give you a little bit of an introduction to the topic, we first need to understand a little bit about infinity. Infinity is a very important aspect of this topic because human beings are a paradox. Not only human beings, in fact, everything created almost in our natural world by HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a paradox. On the one hand, there are finite objects or finite organisms, but on the other hand, they're also infinite. They're both finite and infinite at the same time. How can something be finite and infinite at the same time? A human being, for example, if you study human anatomy and physiology, you'll find that there is layers upon layers of the buildup of the human body, and it all depends on how powerful the lens is. If you have a powerful lens, you see smaller things. If you have a less powerful lens, you only see things that are on the exterior. So it all depends on the power of the lens. You'll see that again in a few minutes. But the human organism, as we will soon show, is both finite and infinite. And in order to understand this paradox and how we can reconcile the two concepts in one organism, we need to explore a bit of mathematics. In mathematics, there is an area of mathematical study called the monster curves, right? Meshuggah monster curves. This began around the 1800s by a famous mathematician from Sweden called Helge von Koch. Helge von Koch created a curve which was called the Coke Snowflake. And the reason it is called the Coke Snowflake is, you'll soon see, is because of the shape of the curve. What he did, Helge von Koch, is he took a simple triangle, he took a middle portion out of each side of the triangle, and he added an extra triangle in that space. And he continued doing this ad infinitum, taking pieces out of the sides of the triangle, adding extra pieces in their place, And as he continued doing this over and over again, he got a curve, a shape of an object which resembled very much like a snowflake. That is why it's called the von Coke Snowflake. Now, the interesting thing about this curve is that it has a finite surface area. In other words, it is within a finite area. If you put it inside a box, for example, this has a finite surface area. It cannot be infinite because it cannot exceed the box. The box is the length times the width, so it is a finite surface area. But on the other hand, if you look at the circumference of this curve, the periphery, you measure the length of the periphery of the curve, you will find that the circumference of this curve is infinite. And how can that be? And just to illustrate that to you, if you zoom in on the curve, as you zoom in, you will notice that there is more and more detail appearing to you as you zoom in further. As you enlarge the picture, you discover more and more detailed structure, and this adds to the length of the curve. And because this complexity of the curve is infinite, you can go on ad infinitum. The periphery of the curve, the circumference of the curve, has an infinite length. So we have a paradox. We have a finite area, but we have an infinite length. Following on the earlier research, came along a French mathematician by the name of Benoit Mandelbrot. Mandelbrot started studying these curves in approximately the 1960s, and he based a lot of his work on another mathematician from France called Gaston Julia, who was around the early 1900s. And Gaston Julia had a different concept of the monster curve. What he did is he took an algebraic equation. He took an algebraic equation, for example, this kind of equation, and he got a result from the equation. The result that came out of this equation, he fed back in to the equation a second time, and he got another result. He fed that result, basically going around in an endless loop, taking the result of the equation and feeding it back into the equation over and over again. What he got from that was a series of numbers that is called the Julia set. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. If the Z is a whole number, if it's a fractional number, it tends closer towards zero. What he did was he took this set and he plotted it graphically, and he got different shapes and different curves. Now, the problem with the Julia set is that to do this process over and over again many, many times is very, very difficult. Where Mandelbrot had a bigger advantage over Julia is that he lived in the period where there were computers. Julia lived before the period of computers. He had to do everything by hand, but Mandelbrot was able to use the power of computers to reiterate, to repeat this process over and over again and generate billions and billions of iterations and repetitions. And he was able to plot that on a graph and see what they looked like. He worked in the 1970s and the 1980s for IBM, and he made use of the supercomputers to do this work for him, to do these iterations, whereas Julia had done them manually. He then formulated a formula for incorporating all of the Julia sets, which were different shapes, into one comprehensive set of shapes all together, compiled together in one set. And he called this the Mandelbrot set. And this is what the Mandelbrot set looks like when it is plotted graphically. Now, Mandelbrot took this a stage further, and he created an area of mathematics, a new area of geometry which hadn't existed until then, and he called it fractals. Anybody's heard of fractals? That was created by Mandelbrot. What does fractals mean? He got it from the word fraction. If you think of dimensions, think, for example, of a one-dimensional object. A one-dimensional object is a line. If you make it into a two-dimensional object, you get the x and the y axes, which is a square. This is two-dimensional. If you add a third dimension to that, you get a cube, x, y, and z axes. Mandelbrot says, what happens if you don't use a complete whole dimension? What happens if you have a dimension between the second and the third dimension, somewhere in the middle? It's a fractional dimension. For example, here's a graphic depiction of it. As the fractional dimension approaches a whole number, it becomes more solid. He called this fractal geometry. Now, the interesting thing about fractals is when you generate the images and the curves which represent these mathematical equations, you get patterns which resemble very, very much the patterns that occur in nature, patterns of leaves, patterns of clouds, patterns of coastlines. The fractal patterns occur very frequently in nature, and this was a good parallel between the mathematical, theoretical field and how to approximate natural patterns in nature using mathematics. This is where Mandelbrot shined. He actually used his mathematics to approximate the patterns that occur naturally in nature in all different kinds of areas. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this highfalutin mathematical theory is in order to give you a picture what infinity is. When you try to picture infinity, it is a very difficult concept to grasp. Infinity is enormously large or enormously small. It's a very difficult concept to grasp, and it's very difficult to picture. But using the Mandelbrot set, it gives you a very good visual perception of what infinity is. And that is why I'm showing you this thing, is in order to show you this video of the Mandelbrot set. Mandelbrot himself called it the thumbprint of God. In other words, this kind of graphics and mathematics is obviously not man-made. It has some higher power, higher design behind it. And I'm now going to show you a little bit of the Mandelbrot set. By zooming in on the set, you're going to see increasing detail. And what is interesting about this is that if you repeat the process over and over, you will get exactly the same thing every single time, because this is based on mathematical equations. And it's not just some image that somebody imagined in their head. It's based on pure mathematics. So sit back and watch this for a few seconds. It's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so that gives you a concept of what infinity means. It means the closer you look, the more you're going to discover. Now, human beings have gone through different periods in their evolution, in their history. And as they progress in their technology, they're able to see more and more detail about the natural world. Until about 1,000 years ago, the only thing that you could see about the human body, which was everything that was on the exterior of the body, what was visible to the naked eye. About the Middle Ages, they began also doing autopsies, actually opening up the human body and finding out what was inside the human body, which allowed them to see more detail than they could see only on the exterior. Around the 1600s, along came a Dutch scientist called Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, which allowed you to see microorganisms which were not visible to the naked eye. This was used to good purpose by Louis Pasteur, who discovered the existence of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, etc. Today we have microscopes which are a lot more powerful than von Leeuwenhoek's original microscope. His original microscope was able to magnify things 1,000 times. The most advanced microscope today is called the scanning electron microscope, which we can magnify objects by 10 million times, which allows us to see the size of atoms. So mankind has progressed in their technology, which allows us to delve deeper and deeper. But obviously, it is very arrogant and presumptuous to think that we have seen everything that there is to see. Because as you can see, this is a progression. As you increase the power of the lens, you're able to discover more that you never knew existed before. So obviously, there are a lot of layers beyond the electron microscope that we have yet to discover. And hopefully, as mankind progresses, we'll discover more. But in fact, the concept of the complexity of any natural creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that it has infinite complexity. It's created with an infinite complexity, which is basically parallel to the infinity which Hashem is himself. Hashem is infinite. Therefore, everything he creates is also, in a certain aspect, is also infinite. Now, we said in the beginning that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man, B'Tselem Elokim. He created human beings with a blueprint, B'Tselem Elokim. What exactly is the blueprint that HaKadosh Baruch Hu used to create mankind? If you look at the first parak of Sefer Bereshit, you will see all the description of the Bria, of the creation. And the word Elokim is repeated throughout. If you count the number of times that the word Elokim is mentioned, you will see that there are 32 mentions of the word Elokim in the period of Briat HaOlam, the 6 days of creation. According to the Sifrei HaKabbalah, these 32 times of Elokim reflect a concept called the 32 paths of wisdom. 32 netivot chokhmah. This is a very important concept in the Kabbalah and the Sifrei HaSod. And what it basically comprises of is two subsections of sets. The first one is Eser Sfirot. It says in Pirkei Avot, Ba'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, he created it with 10 ma'amarot. 10 ma'amarot, this is parallel to something called the 10 Sfirot. We're not going to get into too much detail. It basically reflects 10 filters that allow HaKadosh Baruch Hu to filter the Or HaGanuz, the holy light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the unfiltered light, down into a form that a human being can tolerate. Human beings cannot tolerate the pure light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly, so it has to be filtered through a series of filters that we can tolerate it within our own organism as a human being. This is called the Eser Sfirot. Now, obviously, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world with Asara Ma'amarot, the Ma'amarot were utterances, speaking an utterance. An utterance is using a language. The language used, obviously, was Lashon HaKodesh, and Lashon HaKodesh consists of 22 letters. So if you take these two subsets, the 10 Sfirot and the 22 letters, you get what is called the 32 Netivot Chokhmah. If you look at the book of Sefer HaYetzirah, which was apparently written by Avraham Avinu, you will find a further description of this concept of the 32 Netivot Chokhmah. But what is interesting for the purposes of our discussion today is that this number 32 repeats itself many, many times in different body structures. For example, if you look at the joints of your hand, you count the number of joints between the fingers and the knuckles and the wrist, you will see that each hand has 16 joints. Together, two hands make up 32. Another example of this is in the foot. If you count the joints in the foot, the toes, the different joints, it'll also come to 16 per foot, which makes up 32. If you count the teeth, the adult teeth, the upper jaw and the lower jaw, each one has 16 teeth, makes up 32. The number repeats again. If you look at the nerves that emanate from the spinal column, these nerves radiate throughout the body and control the entire functioning of the body. They're divided up into different sections, C, T, L, S, etc. If you include the brainstem as the 32nd nerve, which is really the nerve going into the brain, then you have 32 nerves emanating out of the spine, which control the entire body. This is an example of the 32 Netivot Chokhmah, and its reflection in the human body. It's repeated many, many times. Now, if you look at the anatomy of the body, they also compare the anatomy of the body, the exterior anatomy of the body, to the Eser Sfirot, and they associate the Eser Sfirot with different parts of the anatomy. For example, Keter is the top of the head, the Binah and Chokhmah is the left and right side of the brain, Gvura v'Chesed is the left and right hand, etc., etc. Hod v'Netzach is the legs, etc. So the association between the Sfirot also associates to the different parts of the limbs of the body. The 22 letters that we spoke about of Lashon HaKodesh is also reflected in the human anatomy. If you count the number of chromosomes in every cell of your human body, you will find that there are 22 chromosomes, plus an extra 2 chromosomes, X and Y, which determine the gender of the person, whether it's male or female. So the number 22 is also very prevalent in the human anatomy and physiology. Another way to correlate the Sifrei HaKabbalah and the human anatomy, they also use the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the 4 letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei, and they associate these with the DNA in the body. The DNA consists of a helical structure, a spiral structure, which contains 2 uprights on the side, spinning around in a spiral, and between these 2 uprights, they have different building blocks connecting to each other. There are 4 building blocks. They are called nucleic acids, adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. And by research done by different researchers in the field of medicine and Kabbalah, they have associated these 4 nucleic acids with the Yud Kei Vav Kei of the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in fact, our DNA is constructed of different combinations of the letters Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is a kind of a divine blueprint in our bodies. That is just a simple general subject about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created human beings, the actual physical structure of the human being. But there are also reflections of the Betamigdash in our anatomy and physiology. By the way, everything that I'm telling you now is not my own research. This is all from existing literature in the Sifrei HaKabbalah, the Sefer HaZohar, Sefer HaYetzirah, etc., etc. And there are also parallels of the Betamigdash in our gross anatomy. For example, before we get to that, we're going to first have a little short tour of the Betamigdash. You can all sit back and enjoy a nice short tour of the Betamigdash, a guided tour. We can't really go there now because of the corona, but if there wasn't corona, we still couldn't go there because the Betamigdash hasn't been rebuilt yet. Hopefully it will be rebuilt before Tisha B'Av. Meanwhile, we're going to have a very short tour of the Betamigdash to show you the different buildings, the different structures, and then we're going to try associate these with different parts of the body according to the Sifrei HaKabbalah. So first of all, let's get going. The Betamigdash was a compartmentalized structure. It was a kind of a mini city. It had many, many parts to it. It was a huge, enormous complex with many, many parts to it. We're not going to discuss all of them because we are limited for time, but we are going to discuss the main features of the Betamigdash. So as I said, it was a compartmentalized structure. It started off with an inner core, and then it expanded outwards, more and more outwards, until it got to the most exterior part. So the inner core of the Betamigdash is the Kodashakodashim. Inside the Kodashakodashim, you had the Aron HaBrit. The Aron HaBrit was the Ark of the Covenant with the Kruvim on top, the Kruvim facing each other, with their wings, Porsek Knafayim Lamala, Sochachim B'chanvehem Al HaKaporet. That was what was inside the Kodashakodashim. If you look in the Aron, you're going to find a number of things. First of all, you have the Luchot HaBrit, Shtei Luchot HaBrit. Those are the 2 tablets, the Shivrei Luchot HaRishonot, the Haluchot HaShniyot, are both in the Aron. You have the Tzintzenet of the man. They took a jar of man from the Midbar and they kept it for posterity in the Aron HaKodesh. You also have the Mateh Aharon that was that flowered and became like an almond tree, that is also stored in the Aron. In addition to that, you also have a Sefer Torah. There's a machloket in the Gemara whether the Sefer Torah was actually inside the Aron or it was actually on a shelf just next to the Aron, a daf yotzeh me'aron HaKodesh. That's not really the topic of discussion. But basically, the Kodashakodashim has the Aron, and the purpose of the Aron is a storage area for the Torah, the Shtei Luchot HaBrit, the Sefer Torah. That is where the Torah is located in the Betamigdash, and it was covered by the Kruvin. As we go outside from the inner core, the next section beyond that was called the Heichal. The Heichal was outside the Kodashakodashim. They were separated by a curtain called the Parochet, and inside the Kodesh, inside the Heichal, you had three different kelim. On the southern side, on the left side, you will see the Menorah. On the right-hand side, on the northern side, is the Shulchan with the Lechem HaPanim, and further back, coming towards the entrance, is the Misbaha Torret. The Menorah, the symbolism of the Menorah, it was a bracha for the light of the Torah, for Chokhmah. The purpose of the Menorah, it was a kind of a conduit, it was a kind of a pipe that allowed the Torah from inside the Kodashakodashim to radiate out and be disseminated throughout Am Yisrael and throughout the world. The purpose of the Menorah was to distribute the Torah that was inside the Aron to the entire world, through the lights of the Menorah to the entire world. That was the purpose of the Menorah. The Shulchan, on the other hand, was a bracha, it was also a bracha, but it was a bracha for Parnasah Chomrit. It was a material blessing of wealth and prosperity, and that also radiated from the Shulchan to the entire world and ensured that the entire world had food to eat and there was prosperity and abundance. The Misbaha Torret, there's different Peroshim, exactly what the tafkid of the Misbaha Torret. One opinion says that it was the power of tefillah. The power of tefillah was the essence of the Misbaha Torret. Another opinion says that the Misbaha Torret was a kind of a secret weapon against bad influences, bad invading influences. There are many examples of this in the Torah. We see, for example, when the story with Parashat Korach, when there was the plague, Moshe commanded Aharon to go out into Am Yisrael, v'lahakriv ketoret, to bring an offering of ketoret in order to stop the magefa, to stop the plague. We also have other stories about this in the Gemara and in Mefarshim, when there was plague, that the people used to say the pitum haktoret after the Betamigdash was destroyed. Just by saying the pitum haktoret, it was a powerful weapon to combat a magefa. So that was the second purpose of the Ketoret, to fight against evil influences and to stop invading evil influences. We're now going to the next level of the compartmentalization of the Betamigdash. Just outside the Kodesh and the Kodashakodashim was a series of compartments. They called ta'im in Masechet Midot, and the purpose of these ta'im was to provide a barrier between the Kodesh and the Kodashim and the exterior of the building. If a person, chas v'chalila, would touch the Kodesh or the Kodashakodashim and he was not the right person, he was not a Kohen Gadol, he was not a Kohen, and he accidentally touched something that was connected directly to the Kodashim, he could die because he was not allowed to come into contact with it. So in order to protect the Kohanim and the Leviim who were working in the Mikdash around the Azara, they compartmentalized the structure around the Kodashakodashim and the Kodesh by adding barriers, a series of walls, a series of floors to create little cells, ta'im, which would separate physically the Kodashakodashim and the Kodesh from the outer wall of the Ulam, of the Mikdash. The whole structure containing the Kodashakodashim and the Kodesh together was called the Ulam. The Ulam was like the big, tall building in the Betamigdash. If anybody's seen pictures of the Betamigdash, the very large, tall building in the center, that is the Ulam. On the walls of the Ulam on the outside, they had windows. These windows are described in the Gemara as shkufim atumim, which means that they were narrow in the inside of the window, and as they got towards the exterior, it widened. They were narrow on the inside, widening as they got out. The structure of this kind of window is exactly the opposite. Someone who's building their own home and wants to have a window. This was before glass was invented. You didn't have glass windows. They had a space in the wall. And if somebody wanted to build a window in their own home to allow as much light into the building, they would do it the opposite way. They would make it wide inside, and they would make it narrow on the outside. The Betamigdash was narrow on the inside and wide on the outside because they were not letting light into the building. The Betamigdash was radiating the Kedusha outwards. So therefore you have this configuration of narrow inside and radiating the Kedusha outwards to the rest of the world. We're going to go further to the next area of the Betamigdash, outside the Kodashakodashim, the Kodesh, that is called the Azara. The Azara was the courtyard, and there are many, many things in the Azara. We're not going to talk about all of them. We'll just concentrate on a few of the most prominent features of the Azara. The first one is the Misbaha Olah, the big Mizbeach in the Azara. That's where they brought all the korbanot. There was a ramp going up to the Mizbeach with 3 ma'arachot on the Mizbeach. In the middle, you had a dome structure of where they used to gather all the ashes. It's called the Tapuach. This is where the korbanot were brought. The Kohanim would walk up the ramp and bring the korbanot. They would sometimes walk along the periphery of the Mizbeach on the ramp going along the sides, and they would do the Zrikat Adam. They would sprinkle the blood on the 4 kranot of the Mizbeach. Keren Dromit Ma'aravit, Tzfonit, Keren Dromit Mizrachit, Mizrachit Tzfonit, Ma'aravit Tzfonit, and Ma'aravit Dromit. Those were the 4 corners of the Mizbeach where they used to sprinkle the blood. The next interesting structure in the Azara was the Kior. The Kior was the place where the Kohanim used to wash their hands and feet before they were allowed to do the Avodah. They had to do Netilat Yadayim and Raglayim. And this was a kind of a tap arrangement where they used to open and wash their feet and their hands. The water supply from this tap used to come from a reservoir. In the time of Shlomo HaMelech, it was called Yam Shlomo. It was a huge, enormous water reservoir that was connected by an aqueduct to a river or a water source just outside the Betamigdash. And this is where the Kohanim used to wash their hands with water. The next interesting structure just outside the Ulam is the stairs going up to the Ulam, which also served as a stage. It was a kind of a bama, and that is where the Kohanim used to stand and sing and play musical instruments every day when they did Shir Shel Yom. That is where the Leviim used to stand and sing and play the musical instruments. Now, when people think about the Beit HaMikdash, you think about 3 Betamigdash: Beit Rishon, Beit Sheni, which was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago, and Beit Shlishi, which is the future Beit HaMikdash when Mashiach comes, Be'ezrat Hashem b'mehera b'yameinu, Amen. But there are another 3 concepts of 3 Betamigdash. There are another 3 Betamigdash which do not specifically refer to those 3 that I just mentioned. The first Mikdash concept is called Mikdash Shel Mala. It is a heavenly Mikdash that Shlomo HaMelech referred to in Shir HaShirim by the term Afar Semon. That is one of the kind of Beit Mikdash, a heavenly Mikdash in Shamayim. We have a second concept of a Beit HaMikdash called Mikdash Shel Mata. Shlomo HaMelech called this Apirion. That is the Mikdash that we build ourselves, and it is a worldly Mikdash that exists on our physical world. The 2 Betamigdash, when the Beit Mikdash is in existence, the heavenly Mikdash and the earthly Mikdash connect to each other. As David said in Tehillim, he says, Yerushalayim habenuya ke'ir shechubra la yachtav. It's as if the city of Yerushalayim connects the Mikdash Shel Mala and the Mikdash Shel Mata. Those are the first 2 concepts, but there is a third concept of a Beit HaMikdash, and that is mentioned in Parshat Shmot, Sefer Truma. It says, Ve'asu li Mikdash v'shachanti betocham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands us to create a Mikdash that he will dwell not within the Beit HaMikdash. It doesn't say v'shachanti betocho. It says v'shachanti betocham, within Bnei Yisrael. In other words, there is a third concept of a Beit HaMikdash that is within ourselves. Within every person, there is a Beit HaMikdash. V'shachanti betocham, everyone has a Beit HaMikdash inside themselves on a spiritual level, and as we're also going to see very soon, on a physical level as well. Now, I'm still continuing with the existing literature on the subject of the parallels between the Beit HaMikdash and the human body. If you look at the gross anatomy of the human body, just with a naked eye without the aid of a microscope, you'll find parallels of the Betamigdash on the structures of the body. Let's quickly review the structure, the compartmentalized structure of the Betamigdash. You have the Kodashakodashim, the innermost part, expanding out to the Hechal, the Kodesh, and that expanding out into the Azara over here. So these have parallels in the human anatomy. We'll start off with the division. The Kodashakodashim, according to the Sifrei Kabbalah, is parallel to the brain, to the area inside the head where the brain sits. That is not hard to understand, because the Kodashakodashim had the Aron HaBrit, which had the Torah, had the repository of the knowledge of the Torah, and the repository of knowledge in the human body is in the brain. So there's a parallel between the Kodashakodashim and the brain section of the human body. The next outer compartment is the Kodesh, the Hechal, which is the face. It has the different components of the Kelim in the Hechal. We'll see that in a very short time. And the remaining parts of the body, the ears, the rest of the limbs, the hands, the legs, etc., these are representative of the Azara. Let's see how this works. If you take the human head and you look at it from a frontal section, and you go inside and you look at the brain, as we said, the brain is the repository of human knowledge, whereas the Aron HaBrit was the repository of the Torah, the knowledge of the Torah. So the two are connected, and they're not only connected in concept, in spiritual concept, they're also connected by their physical anatomy and their structure. So let's have a look how these two can possibly be connected by the structure. If you look at a frontal section of the brain, looking at it from the front angle, look at it very carefully, and if you compare it to the Aron HaBrit, you find that it is very similar to the structure of the Kruvin facing each other. Porse knafayim lemala, sochachim b'chanfehem ala kaporet. So that is the comparison between the brain and the Kodashakodashim. The next section is the Kodesh, the Hechal, and this is compared to the face, the human face. Inside the Hechal, you had three different Kelim. Each one of the Kelim was associated with a different sense. You had the Menorah, which was light. That was the visual sense. Then you had the Misbaha Torret, which was the sense of smell. It was an incense offering. You had the Lechem HaPanim, which was food. It was something that you ate with your mouth. It was associated with the mouth. So let's see how that works. The Menorah associated with the eyes, the Misbaha Torret with the nose, and the Lechem HaPanim associated with the mouth. In last week's presentation, I also showed you that the shape of the Lechem HaPanim also had further anatomical association with the face, in that it represented the Lechem HaPanim and the Levona, represented a smiling mouth and the two eyes. The outer section, the Azara, that is associated with the remainder of the body. You had in the Azara, you had the Kiyol, that's where they used to wash their hands and their feet. The Kiyol is associated with the hand and the feet. The stage, the Madrigot, the steps going up to the Hechal, that was where the Leviim used to stand and sing Shira Shel Yom. That is the sense of sound that is associated with the ears. The remaining parts of the body, the different limbs, etc., are associated with the Mizbeach. That's where they brought the korbanot. They used to slaughter the animal and divide the pieces up into different parts and bring the korban on the Mizbeach. That is associated with the remaining parts of the body. When somebody went to the Betamigdash to bring a korban for a chet, for a sin that he had committed, he would see the korban being sliced up and sacrificed on the Mizbeach, and he would realize how severe his sin was, because in fact he was the one who was meant to be sacrificed. By Kadosh Baruch Hu had rachamim, that he allowed us to sacrifice an animal if we did tshuva and we sacrificed the animal in our place, but it just reflected the severity of a sin. So that is the association in the existing literature of the physical structures of the body with the Beit HaMikdash. Now, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, when we did research in the Lechem HaPanim, we discovered something which evoked an image which reminded me of a picture in one of my anatomy books, which started me off on an area of research and exploration, which indicated that not only does the Beit HaMikdash have reflections in the gross and anatomical structure of the body, but it also has reflections in the cellular structure, the microscopic structure of the human organism. Looking at it under a microscope, you don't only see the gross anatomy, you see the microscopic structure of the body. And that was all stimulated by this coin of the Lechem Hapanim, and we'll soon see that in a few minutes, how that relates to it. So let's look at a human cell. The body is made up of billions and trillions of human cells. That's what the building blocks of the body are. And the human cell, there's different kinds of cells. There's cells in the bones, there's cells in the nerves, nerve cells, there's cells in the skin, epithelial cells, you have cells in the blood cells, all different kinds of cells, but basically all the different cells in the body have a very similar basic structure. They all have a membrane surrounding the cell, a kind of a skin surrounding the cell called the cell membrane. The next area in the cell under the membrane is called the cytoplasm. This is a kind of a gel with a kind of a skeletal structure. We'll talk about that in a second. That is where a lot of things swim around and are located. We'll talk about the different components. And the center portion of the cell, this over here, is called the nucleus. That is the compartmentalization of a cell. The innermost part is called the nucleus. The part outside the nucleus is called the cytoplasm. And this is surrounded by a cell membrane. Obviously, you have different cells next to each other, and between the cells, you have something called the interstitial space. That is the space between the two cells outside the membrane. Now, we talked about the Betamigdash having a compartmentalized structure, the Kodashakodashim, the Kodesh, and the Azara. And if you associate these areas of the Betamigdash, you can associate them with the areas of the cell. For example, if you look at the nucleus, we're going to associate that with the Kodashakodashim. We're going to associate the cytoplasm with the Kodesh, with the Heichal. And the cell membrane is going to be the walls of the Ulam. And the area outside the cell, the interstitial space, is going to be associated with the Azara, with the courtyard. You're going to understand why I associated these things in this way, because they each have similarities to the structures of the Betamigdash. When I was searching for similarities in structure, it was not only structure that I was looking for, it was also function. It was not enough that the element in the cell looked similar in structure to the element in the Betamigdash. They also had to have a similar function. So that were the criteria on doing this research. From here on, I'm going to be giving you the results of the research that I've conducted myself, which is new material that has never been published before, so you're the first to hear it. Here is a picture of the inside of a cell in a little bit more detail. You have the nucleus in the center over here. You have the cytoplasm around the nucleus with all different kinds of elements. We talk about each one in its turn. Then you have the cell membrane around the side of the cell. Now, because there are different types of cells in the body, not every cell looks exactly the same, but most of them have these elements in them. You have the nucleus, which is the garin, the nucleus of the cell. And as I said, I'm associating this with the Kodashakodashim. And I'll explain to you why I associated it. First of all, it's the most inner part of the cell. Its geographical location parallels the geographical location of the nucleus in the cell. But in addition to that, it has a functional similarity. The first thing that you find inside the nucleus is the DNA. The DNA consists of chromosomes. It consists of a helical structure, as I said, like a spiral, connected with different nucleic acids, going up in a kind of a ladder formation, spun in a spiral shape, which is like a kind of a slinky. If you think of a slinky, it's like a kind of a spiral, which allows you to compress a long, long strand, which is actually quite long, into a very small space, into the space of the cell. The DNA is the repository of the blueprint of the body. It's where the Torah, as it were, of the body is located. It is encoded in the DNA. That is where the Torah of the body is stored. It's in the DNA of the cell. That is parallel to the Aron HaBrit, where the Torah was located in Aron HaBrit. Aron HaBrit was the kind of the repository for the the Torah, and the Torah itself is the DNA structure. We talked about Shtei Luchot HaBrit, so the DNA structure has two uprights on either side, which is like Shtei Luchot HaBrit, and you have the connections between the nucleic acids. That is like the Aseret HaDibrot written on the two Luchot. It also says in the Midrash that when Bnei Israel looked at the Luchot HaBrit, it doesn't matter what angle they looked at it from, they could see the Ktav on the Luchot from any angle. So if you think maybe the Luchot HaBrit was in a helical structure like the DNA, it doesn't matter which way you turn it, you can see the structure from any angle. That is a functional association of the nucleus with the Kodashakodashim. The next thing I want to explain to you is how infinite the Torah is. No, obviously nobody can tell you how infinite, because infinity is infinity. But just to show you a parallel to the infinity of the amount of knowledge stored in the DNA, I'm going to show you a very quick calculation. The human body has approximately 37 times 10 to the 12 cells. It's about 37 trillion cells in the human body. It's a huge amount of cells. This is all studies done by scientists to try to determine how many cells there are on average in the human body. Each cell has DNA in it, inside the nucleus. The length of the DNA is 2 meters long. How can it possibly be that DNA is 2 meters long when a cell is microscopically small in structure? The reason is because of the spiral helical structure. You can take the long strand and wind it around, very compacted up in a kind of a helix, and it'll take up very small space. But when you stretch it out long end to end, it is actually 2 meters long of the DNA in each cell. If you take 37 trillion cells and you multiply each one by 2 meters, you get the total length of all the DNA in a human body, and that is 74 billion kilometers long. In other words, if you take all the DNA in your body, in a human body, and you stretch it end to end, the total length of your DNA will be 74 billion kilometers long. You can just imagine the amount of information that you can store on a disk on key, which is 74 billion kilometers long. It's a tremendous, enormous amount of information, which is not exactly infinity, but it gives you a concept how closely approaching infinity is. Just to give you another more visual idea of that length, 74 billion kilometers is 25 round trips traveling from the Earth to the sun and back, 25 times. If you take your DNA and you go to the sun back and forwards 25 times, that's how long the DNA is in your body. That's how much information you have stored in your body. So obviously the Torah is something that is infinite, and the DNA is not exactly infinite, but it's approaching a huge number, which is approximating infinity. The next component in the nucleus of the cell are these little dots over here. These are called ribosomes. Ribosomes are a special component in the nucleus, and the function is to create proteins. Proteins are a very important part of the human structure. You have muscles, which are created from protein, for example. You have hormones, which are the transmitters, the different chemical transmitters in the body, which tell the body what to do to feel sad, to feel happy, to feel depressed, to feel elated, etc., etc. These are all created by ribosomes. The ribosomes are located in the nucleus, and the structure of a ribosome consists of two subunits. It has subunit A and subunit B. The two subunits are not identical in size and in structure. One is a little larger, the other one is a little smaller. They look like this. This is a 3D diagrammatic representation of a ribosome. And when they are synthesizing proteins, before they can begin to synthesize a protein, they have to come together. The two subunits of the ribosome have to come together in a kind of embrace. Once they are touching each other, they can then begin the protein synthesis, which is over here. You see the process of the protein synthesis, a series of building blocks, one by one, of amino acids until the total protein has been constructed. And once the protein has been constructed, it is then released into the body, and the ribosomes separate. In other words, when the ribosomes are creating protein, they're actually doing work. The ribosomes have to be together. When they're doing nothing, when they're dormant, they are apart, they're not together. And the association that I've made to the Betamigdash is of the Kruvin. If you look at the structure of the ribosomes, you'll see an amazing similarity between the Kruvin and the wings of the Kruvin, the Parochet knafayim lamala, sochachim b'chanfehem al hakaporet ufnehem ish el achiv. They were facing each other. And according to the Sefer HaZohar, the Kruvim were children. They were babies. One was male and one was female, hugging in a loving embrace. Another quote from the Zohar is that when Bnei Israel were zoche, when they were worthy and they were serving Hashem in the right way, the Kruvim, it was a miracle, the Kruvim were facing each other on the Aron HaBrit. When Bnei Israel were sinning and they were not worshipping HaKadosh Baruch Hu the right way, the Kruvim would turn away from each other. In other words, a sign of being together and worshipping Hashem is when the Kruvim are next to each other. That is when protein synthesis can take place. When the Kruvim are apart, nothing is being created. The ribosomes are dormant. So we see both a structural similarity and we also see a functional similarity. And these two things, the chromosomes, the DNA, and the ribosomes, are all located in the nucleus, which is the Kodashakodashim. That was where the Torah was located. That was where the Kruvim were located. Surrounding the nucleus, you have a membrane. This membrane has little holes in it they call pores, and they allow the ribosomes to travel out of the nucleus and to start protein synthesis. If you think of a membrane with holes in it, it's a kind of a curtain surrounding the nucleus, which is very similar to the Parochet, which was surrounding the Kodashakodashim. It was not a hermetically sealed area sealed off by a wall. It was a curtain which was permeable, which allowed things to go in and out. The only person who could go into the Kodashakodashim was Aaron HaKohen on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Moshe, when he was communicating with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he used to stand outside the Parochet in front of the Kaporet, facing the Kaporet, and the communication was like a hotline with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, emanated from between the Kruvim, and Moshe was able to communicate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the nuclear membrane is very reminiscent of the Parochet covering the nucleus, which was the Kodashakodashim. Okay, that is the Kodashakodashim. Now we're going to the next section outside the Kodashakodashim, which we said was the Hechal. If you remember, in the Hechal, you had the Menorah, you had the Shulchan, and you had the Misbaha Torret. Now let's look at the different components of the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the area around the nucleus. So the first thing we have, the first structure we have, are these little channels over here. They're called the endoplasmic reticulum. It's a kind of skeletal structure surrounding the nucleus, and this serves a number of purposes. First of all, they provide structural support. The cytoplasm is not just a liquid, it's not just a gel. It has these ribs, it has these divisions in it, which provide structural support for the cytoplasm. They also provide a channel for the ribosomes to travel in and synthesize proteins. And the third function that they serve is nerve impulse transmission. The cell, especially cells which are muscle cells, for example, nerve cells, they conduct nerve impulses, electrical impulses, using these channels of the endoplasmic reticulum. If you have a look at the physical structure of these compartments surrounding the nucleus, it is called cisterns, cisterna ta'alot. And this is very reminiscent of the cells, the ta'im, which was surrounding the Kodesh and the Kodashakodashim to provide physical separation between the Kodashakodashim and the remaining parts of the Betamigdash. So the structure is very similar to the endoplasmic reticulum. The next very interesting component of the cell is called the centrosome. This is one of the most phenomenal, incredible, mind-blowing structures in the cell, and we're going to see this very shortly. The centrosome consists of two subparts called centrioles. They are a bunch of tubes connected to each other, and they consist of two bundles like this at 90-degree angles to each other. Two centrioles make up one centrosome. In most cases, the cell has one centrosome, except for one circumstance. When the cell begins to divide, called mitosis, if you remember your 10th grade biology lessons, the process of mitosis is the process of cell division. When the cell begins to divide, it creates a second set of centrosomes. Each one, the centrosome, migrates to the poles of the cell, one to the one end and the other one to the other end. Between these two centrosomes, you have a bunch of threads connecting the two. They're called spindles. As you can see, they spread throughout the cell between the two centrosomes. And the chromosomes, the DNA from the nucleus of the cell, the nucleus begins to deteriorate, and the chromosomes exit, the DNA exits from the nucleus, and it migrates to the equatorial part of the cell, which is along the center like this, and they arrange themselves in a vertical pattern like this, along the equator of the cell, along the spindles. They migrate along the spindles to the center of the cell. When the cell begins to divide further, there's different stages. There's anaphase, metaphase, telophase, etc. As the cell continues to divide, these chromosomes are going to split up into different pairs. You have one pair on the left, one pair on the right. They're going to migrate towards the poles of the cell, and the cell is going to constrict and divide up and separate into two separate organisms. That is called mitosis. Now, if you look at the structure of the spindles in the cell with the mitosis process, this is very reminiscent of something else we see in the Betamigdash, which is that. The menorah with the lights on top of the menorah. Okay, now that is a very interesting theory, but let's explore it a little bit further and we'll see something absolutely mind-blowing about these centrosomes and the centrioles. If you look at the pasuk talking about the menorah, it says, there was a central arm, and emanating from the central arm, there were three kanim yotzim, they were emanating out from the central kaneh. On each kaneh, there were shlosha gvi'im, meshukadim bekaneh echad kaftor v'ferach. There were three gvi'im. What is a gavia? It's a kind of a cup. It was a kind of a cup structure. And they were clustered. The three gvi'im were clustered together, bekaneh echad. And in addition to the three gvi'im, there was a kaftor. A kaftor is a kind of a round knob. And a perach. A perach is a flower. It's kind of a flower-shaped structure. Now let's have a look at the centrioles. The centrioles are one of nature's most amazing structures because they have a geometrical structure which is the same in every cell. You have 9 bundles of tubes in each centriole, and these are symmetrically arranged in a circle like this, each bundle containing 3 tubes. Bundle 1, bundle 2, bundle 3, bundle 4, etc. until the 9th bundle. They each consist of 3 tubes clustered together. So let's start off with the kanim. The kanim, we said the kanim were the 7 kanim of the menorah, but you also had the base of the menorah, which is the kaneh over here. In actual fact, what I'm trying to do here is to define the structure of a kaneh. The structure of a kaneh, for my purposes, is any part of the frame here which has 1 or 2 elements of the gvi'im, kaftorim, uprachim. For example, this kaneh has 3 gvi'im, kaftor, v'ferach. So does this one, so does this one. The bottom part over here also has a kaftor v'ferach, and this section over here also has kaftorim. So any section that has kaftorim is, in my terminology, considered a kaneh. And if you divide that according to that division, you will have 9 divisions of the menorah which have these elements of gvi'im, kaftorim, uprachim. And these 9 divisions correlate with the 9 bundles of the centriole going around. There were 9 sections of tubes in the centriole. And if that's not enough, it says shlosha gvi'im meshukadim. There were 3 gvi'im clustered together. Look at the structure of each bundle. It contains 3 tubules clustered together in each bundle. It's like shlosha gvi'im meshukadim. A kaftor was a round knob-like structure, which is the overall round structure of the centriole. Look from the periphery. The perach, a flower-shaped pattern. If you trace the ends of the bundles of the centriole, you will see it forms a flower pattern. So here we have a correlation between the menorah and the centrosomes, the centrioles of the cell, not only in the at the architectural structure, but also in the function. The function of the centrioles is division of the cell. It is taking the DNA from one cell and disseminating it further onto other cells. It's propagating the knowledge of the DNA in the nucleus and disseminating it out to the rest of the body, which was exactly the same function as the menorah. The function of the menorah was to take the Torah from the Aron HaBrit and to disseminate it throughout the rest of the world, to take the light of the Torah and disseminate it out throughout the rest of the world. Next structure is called the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion is a very interesting thing. It is called the powerhouse of the cell. The reason it's called the powerhouse of the cell is the area in the cell which is where energy is generated. It's a whole bunch of chemical reactions going on in the mitochondrion called Krebs cycle, the electron chain, etc., etc. The purpose of these is to create energy. Energy is stored in the body in the form of a substance called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. The area of the mitochondrion is where all this happens. It is the powerhouse of the cell generating energy. If you look at the physical structure of a mitochondrion, you'll see it has an outer membrane and it has these channels radiating inwards from the outer membrane in a kind of a rib structure like this. If you compare that to the structure in the Betamigdash, it's very reminiscent of the snipin, the uprights of the shulchan, which had these two uprights, and they had the kanim, the pipes going underneath the bread, like these channels emanating out from the sides of the membrane. And if you think of not only the structure, which is similar, actually the function is also similar, because the purpose of the shulchan, unlike the bread was symbolic of 12 Shiftei Israel that was eaten by the Kohanim, but the shulchan was the kli which transmitted the bracha of abundance to the rest of the world, the bracha of osher and prosperity. That was the shulchan. So the shulchan was basically the powerhouse of the world. It was radiating out energy of abundance and prosperity to the entire world, which is similar in function to the mitochondrion, which is the powerhouse of the cell. Now, as I said in the beginning, the whole subject of this research was instigated and stimulated by a coin that we found in our research of the Lechem HaPanim. We're going to be talking about that soon, sorry. That is in the next section. That is called the Golgi complex. The Golgi complex in structure, what it looks like sacs which are stacked one above each other like that, and little vesicles, little kind of capsules, little kind of droplets which separate from the Golgi sac, and they are transported out of the cell. The function of the Golgi complex is, together with the mitochondrion, it is associated with food and energy. Basically, the Golgi complex is a storage facility. What it does is it packs different nutrients. It packs fats, carbohydrates, proteins into little packages in a vesicle, in a little package, and these packages are transported out of the cell to the rest of the body. So basically, the Golgi body is food. That's what it is. It is food. And if you compare that to the structure in the Betamigdash, that was like the Lechem HaPanim. If you look at the Lechem HaPanim stacked one above each other like that, it is very reminiscent of the stack of the sacs of the Golgi body one above each other like that. The picture that you see over here is an electron microscope photograph of the Golgi body. And now compare that to the coin that I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, which was the coin of the picture of the Lechem HaPanim on the Shulchan, and you'll see that there's an amazing similarity between the Lechem HaPanim on the Shulchan and the electron micrograph of the Golgi body. And it was this image that triggered my research to begin with. I remembered a picture of the Golgi body, and I saw this picture of the Lechem HaPanim, and I said, wow, that is amazing. Maybe there are other similarities, and that got me exploring further, which led me to discover all these other parallels within the cell structure. After the Golgi body, we have all different other kinds of organisms in the cell. You have things called lysosomes, peroxisomes, proteosomes. These are all little things floating around in the cytoplasm. And the purpose of this little cocktail of components, they like different ingredients, the purpose of them is to counteract invading foreign organisms. Lysosomes, for example, are things that destroy invading organisms like bacteria, viruses, etc. For example, somebody who has a shortage of lysosome in their cells, that is what is called Tay-Sachs disease. It's a lack of lysosome in the cell body. So this is a kind of a cocktail of superheroes who are fighting against invading organisms. If you compare that to the component in the Mikdash, that is comparable to the Misbaha Torret. He said that one of the purposes of the Misbaha Torret was to combat bad influences. According to the Sefer HaZohar, the Vatel v'kafit lekama sitrin bishin. That was what the Torah did. It counteracted bad influences. We know that the Ktoret was used to fight a magefa, so it also combated viral, bacterial infections. That was one of the purposes of the Ktoret. They say the Ktoret was so pervasive that they could smell it all the way from Yerushalayim down to Yericho. The woman never needed to put on any perfume because they had the smell of the Ktoret pervading the atmosphere. It was a great smell. But the main purpose of the Ktoret was to fight against these bad invading influences. And the Ktoret was also a kind of a cocktail of different ingredients. You had the tzori, the tziporen, the chelbenad, etc., etc. It was a similar thing in function to the cocktail of the lysosomes, peroxisomes, and proteasomes. Adkan, the Kodesh, the second section of the Betamigdash, we spoke about the nucleus is the Kodashakodashim, the cytoplasm is the Kodesh with the Menorah, the Shulchan, the mitochondria, the Golgi body was Lechem HaPanim, and the peroxisomes with the Misbaha Torret. Now we're going to look at the cell membrane. That is like the wall of the Betamigdash of the Ulam. The cell membrane separates the cell from another cell. It allows transport in and out of the cell by different products using diffusion, active transport, all kinds of methods of transportation. And if you look at the structure of the cell, it was composed of a phospholipid bilayer, two layers of fat connected to each other, studded with cholesterol molecules, and embedded in this membrane structure, you had channels which allowed transport of materials in and out of the cell. And this is very similar in shape to the windows of the Ulam. It was surrounding the Kodesh and the Kodashakodashim. Surrounding the cell was the cell membrane. And these were narrow inside and widening as they got further out, which is very reminiscent of the Chalonot Shkufim Atumim of the Betamigdash, that they were narrow on the inside and widening as they got outside to radiate things outwards from the cell. The next area of the Betamigdash is outside the Ulam, which is the Azara, which is in the cell. It's called the interstitial space, the space outside between the two cells. And in the space between the two cells, you find a number of different components. The first one is called the interstitial fluid. This is practically clear in composition. It's similar to water. It's a kind of a clear liquid. Then you have plasma. Plasma is the blood that flows in the body, in the arteries and the veins. These are also in the interstitial space between the two cells. And if you compare the association of the clear liquid and the blood, that is basically comparable to the kior, which was located in the Azara. It had water which lubricated or washed the Kohen's feet and hands. That is the same function of the interstitial fluid, is to lubricate and to clear, to clean the cells between each other in the space between the cells. The plasma was the blood. That is blood in the body. That's where it's located in the outside of the cell. And the area of the blood, mostly in the Betamigdash, was the Azara. That's where they were doing the shchita of the animals. That's where they were sprinkling the blood on the kranot of the Mizbeach. So this all takes place in the exterior of the Betamigdash, in the Azara, the exterior of the cell. Another component we find in the interstitial space is something called collagen. Collagen is a kind of a fibrous substance, which is a kind of a building block to make up the cell structure, which provides support for the cell. That is why we have vitamin C, for example. Vitamin C is meant to prevent infection because collagen is made from vitamin C and it creates a protective coating around the cell. They're kind of building blocks around the cell. If you talk about building blocks, an area of the Betamigdash that was made out of blocks or avanim was the Mizbeach. It says you're not allowed to make it into from a solid structure. It has to be made from stone. It has to be made from avanim, from separate stones, like the collagen is from separate building blocks. So here we see a comparison between the Azara and the structures in the cell that were in the same area, which was outside the cell, outside the Kodesh and the Kodashakodashim. So in fact, first of all, I want to thank you for your patience. It was a 10th grade biology lesson review. But what I think you understand from this is that the human body is not created in a random structure. There is definite design behind the whole thing. And you can find parallels in the Kruvin, you can find in the Sifrei Kabbalah, and you can find even parallels of the Betamigdash, not only in the gross anatomical structure of the body, but also from my research in the cellular structure of the body. And it is almost a certainty that as you go deeper and explore further, when we get stronger microscopes and we're able to find new structures that we have not seen yet, this is going to repeat, and you're going to find similarities in the further structures as we are able to see them with the technology available to us. Now, an interesting thing about this is that we think, okay, we have a Mikdash within ourselves, but in fact, when you look at our DNA, 99% of our DNA is identical to the DNA of an animal, like a gorilla. A gorilla and a human being, if you compare their DNA, 99% of that DNA is identical, which means that the difference between a human being and an animal is approximately 1% of the DNA. But it is that 1% that distinguishes us from the animals. If a person is very ma'ale ga'ava, he's very haughty, what you say to him, it says in a Midrash, in Midrash Rabbah, Resh Lakish says, if somebody says that he's very ba'al ga'ava, you say to him, well, look at Sheshet Mebriah, you were not created, even the fly was created before you. So you think you're such a gross metzia. The fly was created even before you. It reduces his level of ga'ava. If somebody's very shval ruach and he's very low and you want to lift him up a little bit, you say to him, also in Bereshit Rabbah, you say that you were created before the angels. You even were created before the angels, which means man has importance, but he mustn't overestimate his importance, because even a fly was created before him. So when we talk about B'Tselem Elokim, the blueprint that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was using to create human beings, he was using a divine blueprint, which I think we've only scratched the surface of. I think there's a lot more that we can discover if we research it and we compare it to the Sifrei HaKabbalah and the Psukim. We're going to find a lot more reflections of the Torah in our human anatomy and physiology, which is actually mind-blowing. Where is the neshama in this whole picture? We said that a human being is composed of the physical guf and the neshama. Where is the neshama located? In which layer of complexity is the neshama located? So far, we talked about the gross anatomical picture, what we see with the naked eye. We're talking about the microscope, talking about the electron microscope, which allows us to see the size of atoms. And where is the neshama located in this hierarchy? Perhaps it's located there. Perhaps it's in that layer. But in actual fact, I think we're never actually going to be able to find where the neshama of a human being is located, because just as Hashem is infinite, the neshama is infinite, and it's probably located at infinity. It's never going to be able to be defined totally by science. What is the 1% that differentiates us from the animals? That 1% of the DNA, we're 99% identical to animals, but we have this 1% which elevates us. And the thing that elevates us is the concept of bechira chofshit. We are able to make free choice. Unlike the animals who follow their instincts, what guides them is their instinctual nature. Human beings are able to make conscious choice of what they do. Here we see it from a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim. Habracha ve'aklala is the free choice. You either choose the right way or you choose the wrong way. So a person is able to make a choice. He can choose to be like 99% of his DNA, which is animal. He's the same as an animal. He can choose to go in that direction, or he can choose to follow the 1% which elevates us from that state, which is a more spiritual status, which is not like an animal, it is raised up above an animal status. If you follow your animal DNA and you behave like an animal, as a lot of humankind has done throughout history, you get all kinds of stuff like this. You get war, you get greed, you get violence. That is following the 99% of our DNA, which is the animal part of us. If you follow the 1%, which is the more spiritual part of us, you get something which is a little bit more spiritual. You get achievements of mankind that are not possible with animal DNA. It's something that is a little bit more spiritual. You get achievements like scientific achievements, Mozart concertos, Van Gogh paintings, Chokhmah like Shlomo HaMelech. This is all found in the 1% of our DNA, which separates us from the animals. We have a Mikdash within ourselves. We have something inside ourselves, which is a Mikdash, and that has ramifications. The first ramification is that our bodies are a precious thing, and we have to look after them the way we should. The guf is a kli for the neshama, but it also has kedusha. You have to look after your body. Your body has reflections of kedusha, has reflections of the structure of the Betamigdash. You have to look after your body, keep your health, make sure you eat correctly, you exercise correctly, you don't have a lot of stress, etc., etc. You have to preserve your health. It is a very important part of looking after the Mikdash shebetochenu, is looking after your health. It's very important. I love this quote from Ernest Hemingway. There is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self. We have to choose the 1%. We have to always try improve on ourselves. We have to be superior to the person that we were a year ago. We have to try continue building ourselves higher and higher and higher as we get closer to Akadosh Baruch Hu. And that is basically the essence of what Hemingway is saying in this quotation. If we build the Mikdash me'acha betochenu, this creates an inexorable link between the three Betamigdash, the Mikdash shel Mala, the Mikdash shel Mata, and the Mikdash shebetochenu, the Mikdash that resides within each and every one of us, not only spiritually, but as I have shown now, also on an anatomical, physical level as well. We should all be zoche be'ezrat Hashem to binyan bait shlishi b'mehera b'yameinu, and that we'll all be able to go up to Yerushalayim b'mehera b'yameinu la'akriv zvachim ve'olot, and elevate ourselves and mechaber the Betamigdash one to another. I thank you very much for participating in our presentation today. If you have a minute or two, I ask you please to visit our website, showbreadinstitute.org. We do a lot of research. We do a lot of avodat chesed. If you can help us out in any way to allow us to continue to do this avodat kodesh, please help us out. It helps the running of our organization, which is based completely on public funding. I wish you a Shavua Tov, and I welcome you to join our next week's presentation, which is going to be a live simulation of the Lechem HaPanim, how the Lechem HaPanim was made, how it was baked, how it was switched on the Shulchan. That is going to be on Sunday, this coming Sunday, at the same time. So have a Shavua Tov and Kol Tov.